Good morning, everyone. Morning. Hopefully this is the presentation you're here for. If not, you should stay anyway because it's going to be a good one. This is Thinking Lightning for Visualforce and Apex developers. This is me trying to help you go home, I guess today, tomorrow, feel more comfortable with making the switch to Lightning, even though you might have, you know Visualforce, you know Apex. You should go home, make the switch to Lightning because I'm going to show you you're better prepared for it than you might think. Before I say anything further, I'll show you this slide, which you've probably seen 100 times, 200 times already. Don't make any buying decisions based on any beta or pilot things I'll mention in this presentation. Who am I? I'm Julian. I don't usually look this creepy, as you can see by the picture. If you want to donate to my Movember campaign, it's on here, and you'll have the slides at the end as well. I work for a platinum consulting partner that has been, for me, the best place to work, the most impactful place to work. But don't take my word for it. Check them out afterwards, Slalom Consulting. So, stop me when this sounds familiar. So the example we're going to talk about today is one of Maya, who's an all-star developer for Green Scene. She's built a few Visualforce components. She's built some complex pages for kind of some back office systems integrations. But due to a recent acquisition, she's been tasked with starting to look at Lightning, starting to look at some greatest innovations that can be on the platform for all of the other people in the company that want to get started. She obviously knows Lightning is the way to go, but she's worried that she doesn't have that much experience in Lightning. She's worried that if she makes the switch to Lightning, she's basically taking herself out of a job because she only really knows Visualforce Apex, but she's trying to kind of get that going, right? So how do you get started? How is Maya going to get started? There's really one very simple step. Just do that switch to Lightning experience, and let's see what comes up, right? Take a look around. You'll notice some things that are a little bit different. One thing that's a little different is the header is sticking from page to page, right? That part of the page actually stays constant despite the URL actually changing, despite when you click to other places, that header stays there. And that's pretty different from Visualforce and Classic. The other thing that's different is the components and tabs that are on the page all load independently. So, for example, on here, you can see that everything that's on that News tab, none of it is loading. The page doesn't even know what's on that News tab. None of it exists. The only things that are on that page here are the things that are being loaded. Another pretty significant change is that actions, so things like editing, saving, creating records, all of those are in a modal context. So that, as a Visualforce developer, that probably makes you a little bit scared because you know how that works in Visualforce. But in Lightning, that's all supported out of the box, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. So let's take each of these pieces of your Visualforce Apex development step by step. The first one that's a big difference is obviously the styling, how everything looks. And I'm here with good news is that you can actually use the styles from Salesforce style sheets. It's now recommended, it's now best practice to actually do the same thing that Salesforce is doing. And the way that works is with the Lightning design system. It's a ton of CSS classes that you can reuse for very basic things like standardized icons, standardized colors, standardized spacing of things on the page, and layout of things on the page. There's also some standard components, just like you had in Visualforce, things for output fields, things for input fields. Anything that usually had an Apex tag in Visualforce is going to have a Lightning tag in Lightning, and you can reuse that. Not only that, but there's also a bunch of really cool new components that you have on here. Things like a spinner. No more doing an action function, action support, just to get a simple spinner on the page. That's all out of the box now. Things like a button menu. All of that out of the box again. Things like a dual list box, multi-select pick list. How much fun was that in Visualforce? Now you have that in Lightning with a simple tag. Things like a data table. Remember doing that in Visualforce, having to handle selecting particular rows, having to have actions for each row without ever loading a library? No, now it's out of the box and you can do it here. Now let's talk about Apex. On the Apex side, if you're familiar with remote actions, then you basically already know how to use Apex in Lightning. The only difference is the tag is called or enabled. It's still a static method. You still enforce your sharing, your CRUD, your FLS in Apex with those standard schema methods, with your with sharing, none of that is different in Lightning. With your exceptions, you're using a particular type of exception called or a handled exception. But other than that, it works just the same. And not only that, but you're going to avoid Apex entirely impossible, just like with Visualforce. So standard controller is the equivalent of that is the Lightning data service. Allows you to load fields without ever writing Apex at all. Not only that, there's some tags as well, where you can actually display field label, help text, and values all in one place without ever having to write Apex. So with that, let's check that out in action. So Maya just made the switch. She's on the green scene org. She's starting to look around some things that she had developed before. Obviously, she's starting to get a little bit familiar. But let's look at a particular contact record page here, and I'll show you this particular account tab. You notice something interesting that happened there, right? There was a particular error message that showed up, but then this particular record loaded. And what this is actually, this is a use case that Maya has had at Green Scene where they don't really use contacts. They don't really use accounts. They use contacts mostly, but there's still some fields that are on the account side. And so what we've done here is we've actually loaded an account record detail page on our contact side. So these are all the account fields that you like and love. And not only that, but you have a save button at the bottom. So let's actually look at the code for that. Whoop. In my developer console, it's only 4 or 5 lines of code, right? The biggest one here is this force record data. So this is actually the Lightning data service. We tell it which particular fields and record we want it to load, and then it handles all the rest for us. So what we can do is we can assume when this component is loaded that we're getting the account ID for the contact that we're on, right? That account ID then goes into this loaded contact attribute, and we can reuse that in other places on our component. The second tag I've used here is a force record edit. This is a single tag which displays the entire record detail page for our account in this case. And the only parameter I need to give to that tag is the account ID, the ID of the account that we want to load into that record detail page. And then I have a little save button at the end, and that's it. Just with this code, we've loaded the entire account record edit page. So let's look at the JavaScript side of things, right? This is just kind of your view side of things. If we look at the model side of things, super simple. I didn't write any code for actually loading the page, for actually loading which record we want. All of that is handled out of the box. The only thing that I've written here is what happens when I click that save button. So this is actually reusing some events that we're going to talk about in a second. But this is just basically just doing a save. And so if we refresh the page, what you'll notice again, that little error message at the top, and then everything loads, that's because you have a small delay when we're going to retrieve the account ID, and then we load the rest of the page. So you have that kind of half-second delay while the account ID is loaded, and then the rest of everything shows up. Let's take a look at that super fast. So again, very quick error message while we retrieve the account ID, and then the rest of the page actually loads immediately with all of your fields pre-populated, no code needed here on the script or the controller side. And just to give it a little quick check here, let's say Maya knows that the extension for this account is bad, so we change that, and we'll hit save. Notice our last modified here got updated. Nothing was handled on the Visualforce Apex side. All of that just happened automatically for you. The Lightning data service just handled that field update. Not only that, if I scroll over the account name now, you'll see that that phone number got updated. All handled out of the box. Let's take this a little step further. So I was talking about some of the new components that are available in Lightning. Here's one. So for Green Scene, they actually are really tight with their customers, and they actually like to gather what is their preferred color. So they can send them marketing, they can send them things based on their preferred color. Why not? Well, with Lightning, that's actually pretty good. So before Lightning, you would have seen something like this for the preferred color, right? It's just kind of a hashed color. This doesn't really tell you which color it is. But in Lightning, you have an input type called color input. And not only that, this handles everything. So let's say your preferred color is pink. Again, take a look at the preferred color up here when I click save. It got updated, right? Now again, when we look at the code for this here, super simple. Again, another force record data tag where I'm loading the preferred color for the contact that I'm on without writing any Apex, without writing any JavaScript. This just gives me the preferred color. After that, I have a Lightning input tag of type color that is bound to that field right here. And again, another save button here. On the controller side, again, only thing I have to do is tell it what to do when I hit save. And in this case, it looks a little different, but it just says save the preferred color that I gave you in the input. Again, very simple set of code. You can also see some things here that we've done for the styling, just to make sure that the layout looks good. But that's all that we've got here. A simple, beautiful color picker. Why not? All right. So let's switch back to our presentation here. So we've talked about styling. We've talked about Apex. Next, we're going to talk about JavaScript. You saw there was a lot of JavaScript in that backside controller that we talked about. And what that's basically doing is it's replacing your script tag that you would have had on your Visualforce page. Instead of having all of that in kind of your page mockup and then your script at the bottom or at the top, you put that in a whole separate area so it doesn't clutter everything together. You just have your markup on one side, and then you have your script in your controller. You use a few special methods to essentially tell the component, hey, this is the value that I want to set on this attribute. And no view state. You don't have to worry about view state. Everything, like I mentioned, just like with remote actions, it's all static methods. So everything is within those static methods. There's no concept of view state that you have to worry about at all. Not only that, you're talking about smaller components. So usually that wouldn't be necessarily that much of a worry. Locker service you might have heard of. That was more of a concern last year, I would say. What that means is you can't go ahead and go get a particular field value that's on a whole different controller that's not part of you. You can't go steal Salesforce values from another component and bring them to yours. That's all that means. So when you compare that with Visualforce, there's a pretty big difference, right? Here, it's kind of a puzzle. You're talking about the HTML rendering is all done on the server side, not on your browser. All of that is kind of a black box to you. You just receive what was done by the Visualforce server side. Here with Lightning, you have the client is actually responsible for doing all of that. So your browser, your Chrome, is actually doing a lot of the rendering. What's happening is Salesforce is just giving that to your client kind of the steps that it needs to do to actually load the page. Now, Lightning, as I'm sure you've heard, has or deals a lot with events. And so what that means is no more re-renders, no more AJAX, no more action support. None of that stuff from Visualforce anymore. You can go ahead and use actual things like an on-click, like you probably used to if you've written JavaScript. You have some system events, too, that you can listen to. So when the component is initialized, you can respond to that event. When an attribute value is changed, you can respond to that event. You listen to those events with an Aura handler, which I'll show you in a second. And so what that means is you're using events to do simple things like changing the page that you're on or going to a different record. All of those are events. Not only that, you can define custom events as well. Let's see that. Let's see an example of that here. So one of the things Green Scene does is they handle a lot of cases over the phone, and they want to pre-populate a lot of that case information with a simple button here. So let me show you what happens when I click this. Modal pops up, which we would expect, again, with actions. Actions are in a modal context. And what happens with Green Scene is they need to check whether you have open invoices before you actually log a case. So what's happened here is I've checked the open invoices, and I can go ahead and open a case, or I can go ahead and cancel this particular modal. And I'll show you what happens when I click open a case. It actually loads the new case page with the contact that I'm on here. So a few things have been pre-populated, and this is all on the new case side of things. So let's take a quick look at the code here for that. Markup side is super simple, right? The only thing that we had was a small modal that had two buttons on it. There was that cancel button on the left, and there was that open a case button on the right. And you can see here that those buttons have a simple on-click which is going to run the c.closeModal method. So what that's saying is it's go to the controller, right? This is where all of our script tag methods logic live. Those are on the controller, and it's going to run your closeModal or your start case method. Not only that, I talked about the handlers for the system events. So this one is called init, and what that means is when the component is initialized, it's going to run the do init action when the component is loaded. So let's take a quick look at that. So for example, when we're looking at when the component is initialized, right now it's not doing much, right? It's just logging to the console that the invoices are checked. But you can imagine that here is where you would run some Apex code to say, hey, go check the invoices before we actually let this person open a case. The more interesting methods here are those two buttons that were at the bottom of that action, right? One was the open a case, and one was the cancel button. So let's look at the cancel button first, actually. The cancel button is a very simple event. And why do I know it's an event? Because I can see that I'm firing the event, right? So in a single line, what I'm doing is I'm running this particular close quick action event, which is an event that's provided to you out of the box by Salesforce. And the only job of that event is to close the modal that you're on. That's all it does. So it throws an event out there to say, hey, close the modal that I'm on, and Salesforce is like, it does all the magic to say, hey, I know which modal you're on, and I'll close it for you, and that's it. All of that is done for you out of the box, and we'll look at that in a quick second here. The other one here is the one for starting a case. So again, I'm actually using a Salesforce event that's available out of the box. It's called create record. This create record event takes some parameters here. One of the big ones is I need to tell it what type of record do I want to create. So I'm telling it create a case. And not only that, I can also give it some default field values. So all of those JavaScript buttons that you wrote before for pre-populating some record detail pages, this is how you would do that now, right? You're telling it, open the modal for creating a record, which object do you want to create, and which fields do you want to populate. So in this case, we're populating the contact ID to say which contact was I on, and we're populating the origin because we know it's a phone case. The one thing you got to make sure not to forget, don't forget to fire the event. It's not enough to just create it. You have to fire it at the end to make sure that event actually happens. So let's look at this again, right? The cancel button, single line of code for closing the modal that I was on. Super simple. Salesforce handles kind of all of that magic behind the scenes for example, how to open a case, how to handle a lot of those events as well. So again, open a case. Salesforce handles all of that, right? Once I click the button, my code is done. Salesforce handles all of the piece around pre-populating, actually creating the record, all that good stuff. All right. So let's do a quick recap. Where is this all going? A few places for other components, but these are basically the same as Visualforce, right? Homepage, custom tabs, and that little button that you saw in the modal. Obviously, on your record detail pages, you can have different components that are all put together. And you can still do all your standard action overrides. So overriding your edit page, overriding your new page, still exactly the same in Lightning. And a quick recap. Things that I mentioned, pages, think in components now. So script tags, very similar to what you had before, but instead of putting those in a page, you're putting those in a controller. A lot of the tags, the Apex tags, are handled in Lightning. Your expressions, your curly bracket bang expressions, those are handled the exact same way in Lightning, or almost the same way. And your remote actions, similar to your or enabled Apex methods. So again, the big takeaway here, you're not really reinventing the wheel. You're just adding little bits and pieces to the existing Lightning interface that is available in Salesforce, right? You're just adding a component. You're adding a particular action. You're adding a button. You're not revamping an entire page. You're not kind of doing those big wholesale changes. So what do I want all of you to do? Go home, try it out. Make the switch to Lightning Experience. A ton of Trailhead modules out there. Take a spin through the Lightning design system. Check out those CSS classes, because it does a lot of magic for you. Learn more about JavaScript, because that's where it's going. And there's my website for the link to the presentation and some more information. Thanks, everyone.